Amy!
Hey, Amy!
Amy, we're here!
I know, this is like a miracle of some sort.
I know!
It's a miracle.
It's a miracle!
Just like Jesus walking on the water.
It's coming!
Alright, let's have a choice. Do we
Oh.
want to talk about what we're doing? Or talk about what we want to do, not what we're doing, because I have no clue. Or do our little study thing and then talk about that.
Dude, if you prepared it, let's just rock it.
Okay. I didn't prepare a whole lot, but
Well, we can do a little.
I was trying to think of doing something that was completely opposite of what Jana was doing. Like, just totally opposite. And so I thought of my favorite author, Peter Rollins, and so I brought just a little segment of part of his book, and
The spiritual undisciplines.
basically, you'll see how opposite it is when we start reading it. So,
Spiritual underwear.
so we're going to read the first chapter, and then we'll read the introduction. And I know that sounds backwards, but it'll make sense. So anyway, the book is called Fidelity of the Betrayal, and it was written like in 2009 or something like that. Amy, I put that link on Facebook for the
I've got
book.
it on the iPhone.
Yeah, perfect.
Nice.
I printed off copies here.
Dude, can we see the cover of that book? That looks kind of interesting.
Yeah,
It's yellow.
Oh.
yeah.
I'm not sure of this whole Paul.
Those look like some nice spectacles if you put it up this way.
That's right. So it's a book I read several times, and I think it's just really interesting to me. Might not be interesting to you, but yeah. So anyway, we'll just read, and I'll read some, and then we'll just pick up and read, and we can discuss after we read. All right, we're going to start, Amy, just so you know, at chapter 1, which is page 13, and it says the betrayer, the betrayed, or the beloved.
I got it.
Okay. If there is any name that acts as a, I don't even know this word, sorry, metonymy for betrayal, then it is likely to be none other than that of Judas. The Christian tradition, which would appear to be in some way indebted to him for its very existence, is awash with images of a man as a demonic messenger, a lover of money, and a traitor to the Son of Man. For some, Judas is not simply an evil individual seeking the satisfaction of his own insidious desires, but rather is portrayed as the very embodiment of the evil on earth, a metaphysical manifestation of all that is opposed to the good, the noble, and the just. Thus, this anathema of the church against him is viewed as entirely justified. He not only betrayed innocent blood, but also spilled the very blood of God. Judas did not conspire merely in a murder, but in a deicide. This popular view of Judas maintains the position that regardless of what transpired from the act in question, that infamous betrayal was conceived and carried out by a criminal mind that was prepared to sacrifice the Messiah for a handful of silver coins. Regardless of how God employed that treacherous kiss or how subsequent events redeemed it, the act itself is still to be condemned in the strongest possible manner. Indeed, upon first reading the biblical narrative, one would deem this to be the only plausible account. While in the Gospel according to Mark, the earliest Gospel, we find no explicit explanation as to why Judas decided to betray Christ. We read in Matthew that money is the principal cause. The Gospel according to Luke, written around the same time, mentions an additional reason, claiming that Satan had entered Judas, encouraging him to commit the act. In John, the latest Gospel, we find that Judas seems primarily inspired by demonic influence. Then to top it all this off, in the book of Acts, we play a piano. We discover a particularly gruesome end to the betrayer. Here we read that, with the reward he got for his wickedness, Judas bought a field. There he fell headlong. His body burst open, and all his intestines spilled out. We go on to find that, according to this account, his death earned this plot of land the description field of blood. Anybody like to pick up?
Sure. However, when confronted with this traditional reading of the Judas-Jesus relationship, one must wonder who the real betrayer of the story is. For if, as an initial reading of the text would imply, the betrayal was deemed necessary for the rise of Christianity and the fulfillment of God's will, then we are presented with the image of Judas as one who was in fact central to the outworking of divinely ordained plan. With this in mind, one might ask whether it was really Judas who was betrayed by Jesus rather than the other way around. Is it not true that Judas believed that he had been called to partake in the abundant life promised by Christ? Is it not likely that he believed he would find freedom, liberation, and purpose as a disciple of Jesus? Yet the traditional reading of the story would seem to suggest that Judas was really called to fulfill the role of an expendable pawn in a cosmic game. The Gospel, according to John, portrays Jesus as knowing at a very early stage about what was going to take place. In other words, he knew what would transpire from the very beginning, long before Judas would have ever even conceived of the plan. If this is true, if Jesus did know what Judas was capable of from early on, then the narrative compels us to ask why he called him to be a disciple in the first place, or why Jesus did not endeavor to both warn him about his weakness for money and to ensure that he was never in a position to give in to such temptation. Surely, if someone knowingly offers a recovering alcoholic some wine, then that person is implicated in the consequences. The ultimate betrayal, according to this traditional reading, could thus be said to the one perpetrated by Jesus against Judas, rather than the other way around. The ambiguity of the phase, the betrayal of Judas, captures this undecidability in the traditional reading beautifully. In the Gospels, do we witness the betrayal of Judas against Jesus, or the betrayal of Judas by Jesus?
Next.
Oh,
You don't have to look up it.
okay. Well, there is a certain ambiguity. Somebody say the word.
Ambiguity.
Ambiguity. Thank you. Within the traditional reading of the story regarding who the ultimate betrayer really was, Judas is still viewed as the corrupt and evil. Second reading, his moral weakness is merely manipulated to fulfill the divine purpose. Yet there's another way of reflecting upon the actions of Judas, one that argues that it is very possible for Judas to have had less insidious motivations for handing over his teacher, motives that were not selfish at all. For instance, it is quite possible to imagine that Judas was actually attempting to force a confrontation between Jesus and the chief priests, a confrontation that would destroy the unjust power and authority of the latter. After all, it would seem that many, including the disciples, expected Jesus to directly confront the dominant religious and political powers of the day, setting in motion a revolution that would result in the establishment of the earthly messianic kingdom. Indeed, the title Iscariot, thank you, hints that at the possibility that Judas had once been a member of the Zealots, a select few who advocated a violent revolution that would enshrine the rule of God within a political system. With this in mind, one could argue that Judas, frustrated by the lack of concrete political action among the disciples, was actually attempting to force Jesus' hand, placing him in a situation in which he would have to act in a decisive manner against the ruling powers. It is not difficult for us to imagine this whenever we remind ourselves that Jesus had taught his disciples to confront those who they betrayed, those who they believed were in sin. By bringing Jesus' face to face with the temple hierarchy, Judas perhaps hoped that Jesus' call for repentance, along with a demonstration of his power, would be enough to revolutionize the religious system. This interpretation is not without biblical support. For instance, it can help us to appreciate the description of Judas' death as found in the Gospel according to Matthew. In contrast to the description in the book of Acts, the Gospel of Matthew paints an image of Judas as one who is racked with guilt, gave the money back to the authorities before hanging himself. Because the money had been given in exchange for the betrayal of the innocent blood, the religious authorities could not put it back into the temple treasury, and so used it to buy field, calling it the field of blood. Sorry. interesting, to signify that it had been bought with blood money, rather than Judas's stomach bursting open, as if by some divine act of retribution we are presented with a broken man who experienced such a deep regret for what had transpired that he had to commit suicide. It is difficult to interpret this as an act of cold and remorseless killer who had been carefully planned the arrest and execution of Jesus. Rather, it seemed to be more in line with the act of one who had set in motion a series of events with results that were both unforeseen and undesired.
At this point, we have considered the image of Judas first as a betrayer, second as a betrayed, and third as misguided. There is, however, another possibility, one that may seem more shocking than any of these. For one may ask if there is a hint within the Gospels that Jesus not only knew that Judas would betray him, or willed this betrayal so as to fulfill a divine plan, but actually commanded Judas to betray him. We've already noted that the Gospel of John informs us that, at an early stage, Jesus knew what Judas was going to do. What if Jesus knew at an early stage precisely because Jesus was planning to ask him to do it? If we pay close attention to the Gospel of Mark, we find sacred. Oh, no. If we pay close attention to the Gospel of Mark, we find at least some hints that such an idea is possible. In order to draw this out more explicitly, we must consider what is said to take place moments before Judas approaches the chief priests and elders. Just before this infamous encounter between Judas and the temple authorities, we find that Jesus is in Bethany with his disciples at the home of Simon the leper. While they are eating dinner, a woman enters with an alabaster jar full of richly scented, expensive perfume. Without any encouragement, she approaches Jesus and carefully breaks his jar above his head so that the perfume drips down over his entire body. Some of those present express anger at this excessive act, arguing that the perfume could have been sold and the money distributed among the poor, which, by the way, is exactly the type of response we ought to expect from those who had lived with Jesus. But surprisingly, Jesus responds to this remark by rebuking his friends, informing those gathered that the woman was acting in accordance with divine will because she was preparing his body for burial. Once Jesus has said this, Judas rises, leaves that place, and goes to the chief priest with his deal. The question that immediately sprang to mind when reading this narrative include, how did the women know to engage in this symbolic act? How did Jesus know what this act signified? And why did this event seem to act as the catalyst for Judas's act of betrayal? A careful reading compels us to wonder whether some previous discussions had taken place, hidden from prying eyes. One wonders whether Jesus, Judas, and this mysterious woman had actually met together previously in a clandestine location so as to carefully script the upcoming events. That's crazy. Like crazy to think about. This scenario gains a small amount of credulity when we know how Jesus comments that a betrayal must take place in order to fulfill the scriptures, the way in which Jesus said to Judas just after the infamous kiss, "Friend, do what you came for," and the fact that Jesus is presented as knowing in advance about the act, even asking that Judas perform it quickly. In cinematic terms, we find a powerful exploration of this interpretation in Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ. This adaptation from Nikos Kazantzakis' novel of the same name presents the relationship between Judas and Jesus as deep and loving. In the film, both are presented as revolutionaries, but while Judas is dedicated to the violent overthrow of Roman rule, Jesus is seeking a revolution through the power of love. As the film unfolds, Jesus' ministry takes him to Jerusalem, where he finds the temple overrun by money changers. The longest chapter ever continues at...
You don't have to read it.
Someone else, please start at top of page 20.
After overturning their tables, he leads a small army against the temple rulers. Yet, at the last moment, he refuses to give in to the temptation of violence and, on the threshold of the temple, returns to his message of love. But this message also requires bloodshed, because for his revolution to take hold, he must not kill, but rather die. He must lead as a martyr rather than as a tyrant. And if Jesus is ready to die, then he must turn to one who he knows is ready to kill. And so he turns to Judas. In tears, Judas agrees. One immediate problem with attempting to reread the narrative in this way concerns the seeming anathema pronounced against Judas in the Gospel of Matthew, in which Jesus says, "But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." Yet on closer inspection, these words may yield a very different meaning to what we at first assume. For although these words are traditionally presumed to represent some kind of curse and condemnation, the wider biblical context mitigates against such a reading. First, why would Jesus curse the one who was about to betray him? Did Jesus himself not teach that one must bless those who seek to harm us? Second, such pronouncements of woe in ancient Judaism are generally expressions of love and concern rather than hatred or retribution. And finally, did not Judas himself, as portrayed in the Gospel of Matthew, judge that it would have been better had he never been born, thus giving weight to the possibility that these words were said with heartfelt pain and foreknowledge rather than in a spirit of hatred and desire for revenge? Is it possible then that Jesus himself not only wanted Judas to betray him, but actually demanded it? Is it possible that Jesus, as portrayed in the Gospel of Mark, possessed the insight that for his mission to expand and impact the whole world, this betrayal needed to take place? And is it then possible that the singular betrayal is one that actually testifies to a profound fidelity? It is with such a reading in mind that the philosopher and cultural theorist Slavoj Žižek goes so far as to write that while in all other religions God demands that his followers remain faithful to him, only Christ asked his followers to betray him in order to fulfill his mission. It should be pointed out that this rather unorthodox reimagining of the Judas-Jesus relationship, whether it has any basis in reality or not, is not an endorsement of the Gnostic figure that we encounter in the Gospel of Judas, a figure who gives up Jesus so as to free him from the confines of the mundane material world, the Judas to whom the Gnostic Jesus says, "For you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." For in stark contrast, the betrayal as presented in the canonical Gospels is one that brings about great mental and physical suffering to Jesus rather than an anticipation of freedom and liberation. So much so that the Gospel of Matthew informs us that shortly before Judas approaches, Jesus tells his disciples, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." More than this, the Gnostic interpretation is focused upon Jesus escaping from the material world, while the betrayal described above is precisely the means by which Jesus enters into the world in a more radical and universal way, becoming present at every place where the naked are clothed, the starving are fed, and the thirsty are given water.
With all these possible readings, is it any wonder that various poets, artists, and philosophers throughout the ages have been intrigued by the actions of Judas and unconvinced by the commonly accepted interpretation? The Gospels leave us with an ambiguous yet mesmerizing act, an act that has allowed poets and literary figures the freedom to pose interesting questions and lead us into reflections upon fascinating scenarios. Indeed, the polymorphous nature of the text itself ensures that a single interpretation of Judas and his motives lies beyond the realm of biblical theology and finds its true home in the wide expanse of the artistic imagination. Regardless of which account does the most justice to the events that took place all those years ago, such discussion opens us up to conceive the difficulty of viewing this act as a simple and straightforward act of betrayal. The involvement of God, the complicity of Jesus, and the eventual outcome of the act all point to a situation that is far from simple to understand. Indeed, one begins to understand that a betrayal might be approached as an act of fidelity if looked at in a different light. In order to see this, let us take into consideration a recently discovered fragment from the long-lost Gospel of Peter. Early that evening, while the other disciples were busy preparing for the upcoming feast of unleavened bread, Judas fell into a deep and unexpected sleep. As he lay there without moving, he received a vision of the future. In this vision, Judas saw himself with the other disciples as they shared a Passover meal with Jesus. During the meal, he could hear his master speak solemnly about his own death while breaking bread and pouring wine. Then the vision progressed, and Judas saw himself secretly meeting with the chief priests and agreeing to hand Jesus over to them. The vision continued by showing Judas kissing Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, followed swiftly by the arrest, trial, torture, and death of Jesus. Yet the dream did not end there. Instead, Judas went on to witness his own sorrow and remorse at his acts, and to witness firsthand his own suicide. This was immediately followed by a deep pain as he was confronted with wave after wave of condemnations and judgment aimed at him through the ages. Yet in this vision, he also witnessed the resurrection and ascension of Christ. He saw the spread of Jesus' message, its victory over the forces of Rome, and the way in which it transformed the lives of countless millions. When Judas awoke from this dream, he remembered some words that had been spoken to him by Jesus. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Those who love their life will lose it, while those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. In light of this startling new evidence, let us imagine for a moment that we are the ones in this situation, awaking from this horrifying dream. In the aftermath of such a vision, the question we would have to ask is, what would Jesus do? For Judas to betray Jesus without any knowledge of what would transpire may well represent the ultimate act of betrayal, but here we must ask whether choosing these actions with foreknowledge would represent the ultimate act of fidelity.
There are countless people who betray Christianity. Individuals who turn their backs on its message because they no longer believe in it or because it asks too much of them. But there are a few who betray Christianity, not because they no longer believe in it, but because they believe in it so deeply, because they understand that unless the seed of our Christianity falls to the ground and dies, it will remain a single seed. But if it is allowed to die, it will produce many seeds. With this in mind, we may wonder whether the deepest cost entailed in embracing the radical message of Christ, that we lay down our life and pick up our cross and follow him, may not simply be the call to sacrifice our own life, something we were asked to do before we pick up the cross, but the call to sacrifice what we love more than our life. The cost of Christianity, for so many, is thought to lie in the demand that we die to ourselves for the sake of our Christianity. The cross we are called to carry is thus one upon which we are to be put to death. But what if this cross we bear had another meaning? What if the cross that we are called to carry is not for us at all, but rather, like the cross that Simon of Cyrene labored beneath, it is really for another, a cross for us to crucify what we love? Is it possible that the cross we labor beneath must be used to crucify our Christianity? How many of us can truly understand this question? How many of us can really know what it is like to destroy what we love for the sake of what we love, to be the most faithful of betrayers? Yet perhaps it is precisely this that we are being called to, engaging in that most difficult task of putting our religion to death, so that a religion without religion can spring forth.
All right, and then we'll go to the introduction. We're just going to read a little segment of this. You want me to read, Elizabeth?
Sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
No, I was lost. What would Judas do? Well, that's not as common of a phrase. What would Jesus do? So, in the 1990s, the phrase, what would Jesus do, became a popular slogan for millions of Christians across the English-speaking world. Originally inspired by the book In His Steps by Charles Sheldon, these words were quickly reduced to the abbreviation WWJD and etched onto countless bracelets as a way of reminding the bearer that they held Jesus up in the ultimate authority in moral, political, and religious matters. These bracelets quickly became a popular accessory among Christian teenagers, so much so that the letter WWJD started to appear on a whole range of consumerist products such as jewelry, bumper stickers, badges, bookmarks, key rings, and even underwear.
Of the various predictable parodies that arose in the aftermath of this widespread phenomenon, there was one that struck me as particularly intriguing and insightful. The parody in question came to my attention via a website that playfully offered the following advice. When life throws you a curveball, remember to ask yourself, what would Judas do? Although the actual intention of the website was superficial and satirical in tone, carrying mock testimonies of people who had considered this question and then gone on to lie, steal, and seduce, I was struck at the time by the thought that, far from offering some immoral, anti-religious sentiment, the question, what would Judas do, could perhaps offer us a tantalizing hint of what it would mean to ask, what would Jesus do?
Oh, I can't. In other
I didn't know
words,
where you were.
oh, yeah. In other words, what would Jesus do when confronted with Christianity today? Would Jesus do what Judas did and betray it? In saying this, I'm not hinting at rather mundane insight that Jesus would betray the anemic, inauthentic, self-serving churchianity that so often festers quietly under the banner of Christianity today. I'm not asking whether Jesus would turn the tables on what passes as contemporary Christianity in favor of a more robust and radical version that may have once existed in an age long past. Rather, by asking Jesus would betray Christianity as Judas betrayed Christ, I'm asking if Jesus would plot the downfall of Christianity in every form that it takes. Or rather, to be more precise, I'm asking whether Christianity, in its most sublime and revolutionary state, always demands an act of betrayal from the faithful. In short, is Christianity at its most radical, always marked by a kiss, forever forsaking itself, eternally at war with its own manifestation? Such thinking leads to the seemingly paradoxical idea that the deepest way in which we can demonstrate our fidelity to Christianity is to engage in a betrayal of it. If this is the case, then, in order to remain true to the spirit of WWJD, the desire to emulate the life of Christ, we must inscribe the J with an ambiguous double meaning, one that simultaneously references both Jesus and Judas, one that dances between the two, one that cannot separate them any more than we can pry apart the two sides of a Mobius strip. The end.
What's a Mobius?
Mobius strip.
It's a two-dimensional figure with only one side. Like take a strip of paper, like a long strip of paper, and then you flip one side and tape it together. It only has one side, but it's two-dimensional.
Ah.
You need something that's thinner than this too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess for me, reading this years ago and still reading it, thinking about, it's not necessarily about, and I think some people would read it and get offended by the fact that he might read other things into Judas than what's been traditionally taught to us. And his whole idea is not necessarily to focus in on the interpretations, but to ask ourselves questions about what kind of Christianity we're giving ourselves to, and what kind of life for Jesus are we really living? Is it one that is like Jesus on the edges or the margins of religiosity? For him, he thinks that most of Christianity reflects this kind of fake, rigor mortis kind of Christianity that doesn't really have any life and doesn't really do anything. It just perpetuates the same stuff it always does and doesn't really move the way that Jesus' movement moved. And it doesn't challenge us the way that Jesus' life really should challenge us based on how he lived and how he did things. And so I guess for him, his idea is that to really open up Christianity into something that would be beyond itself now would be the same way as it did when it first started, is that a death had to take place. And he thinks that Christianity needs to die in order to take a new shape, to be something new. That it's not going to take a new form. It's not going to be anything different until it goes away completely. So that's kind of some of the ideas of the book or whatever. But he's got a lot of other theories and thoughts, being a philosopher and theologian. But so, any thoughts about the Judas stuff or the idea of some fidelity and betrayal?
I thought this section was really interesting when it talked about just like how you kind of said letting Christianity die to have it be able to kind of like reincarnate as what it should be. That was a little bit confusing when we were first reading it. I think I kind of understand it now. But do you have examples of how you would see that Christians would be doing that now? Kind of crucifying their Christianity to have it be resurrected? It's an interesting.
I think for him, the idea is that Christianity is not Christianity. That it's not Christianity dies and then we have a new Christianity. It's Christianity dies and something else takes place. Something else forms. Something else is born. And we wouldn't call it that anymore. Because that was this. And
one of the sense I got from him, he was talking about an anti-religious religion, or something along those lines, is that most of what Jesus was saying wasn't about there's a structure, there's an institution you need to follow. It was a lot more personal than that. Maybe you don't need a whole institution of the church and priests and ordination and everything that's kind of accumulated over the centuries to follow Jesus' message. That was kind of what I was reading from it.
Just kind of in the literal sense of the story, that's always been, I don't know if we've had that conversation or if I've had it with somebody else, but it's always been interesting to me how, regardless of whether or not he meant to do it, Judas obviously plays a part in how Christianity develops, regardless of if he did it on purpose. Well, he did it on purpose, but whatever his motives were behind that. Looking not kind of at his side, but just on what it did to the faith and what it did to that belief and how it led to, like if that had not had happened, what would have happened as far as Jesus is concerned, so there, but that, and I think in that point too, it always, in kind of in a different question, in a different way, it's interesting to think about those, it's kind of a scary thought too, that something that's seen as kind of evil like that is something that's maybe necessary, kind of necessary evil, kind of comes into my mind. And like I said, I don't know if it really was his motive to be that way, but just kind of that thought is kind of a challenging one to me, kind of a scary one to me, just thinking about, we may do some bad things in the name of our faith, but if we don't do them, maybe this won't happen. Like that kind of idea, I think is a very challenging one to deal with as well.
It's funny. I kind of had a different response to it. I didn't get. It was a little. I don't know if this is even the right word, but a little bit comforting, because you felt like Judas was forgiven. And that's even a strange statement to say, I guess. But if Judas was kind of in on knowing what his place would be, you had an idea that God understood that as well, and that he wasn't going to persecute him forever for having that role. So I know and to me, God is a God of grace and a God of forgiveness, and if he had a role, I would like to think that God would treat him with equal forgiveness as he would anybody else. So I don't know, it's kind of odd, but for some reason I kind of was okay with that theory.
One thing that I like to think about in connection with Judas is Peter at the same time, because Judas betrays Jesus and tells the authorities where he is, but Peter also that same night betrays Jesus in another way by saying he never knew him, he wasn't one of his followers, and so on. And then Judas goes and commits suicide. Peter goes on to be the leader of the church.
Oh, right.
And I think part of the difference there is how they reacted to. They both did something they considered to be wrong, but then do you accept the forgiveness of Jesus, try to repent and try to do something, or you say, my life can't go on? And part of the difference between them is how they react to their betrayals rather than what the original act was.
Yeah, you almost have to wonder, like, what would that have looked like if Judas had not committed suicide? Would he and Peter have maybe competed for, some type of, I don't know, authority? I don't know. Interesting.
And I can see like all the different angles for sure. It's just like that one, the way he dies, and I guess in Mark when he commits suicide. If it's like as this author would suggest, or an interpretation, if you see that as Judas being so loyal that he is willing to, even though he doesn't know this is happening or that he's going to do this, his faith leads him to suicide because of what he loves. That sounds a whole lot like something else to me.
Yeah.
That happens in our world, and not that it's necessarily saying that, but that's just one of the thoughts that popped into my mind. Is that
I don't know if he connected those two. I think he connected the suicide to his pain of seeing what he did and his unintended consequences. Because the whole idea about, which is very plausible, that Judas, being a zealot, wanted to see the overthrow of the Roman Empire by the Jewish people, and Jesus was going to be that ruling king. And so him trying to move that into place, yeah, I get where you see that in other, aspects of today or whatever. But his suicide wasn't celebrated. It was through the pain of realizing what he didn't bring about the change that he thought, because that was never the change that was going to exist anyway. Like, that wasn't how Jesus' role functioned. So it was through that pain of remorse, not being able to forgive himself, to seek forgiveness from anyone else, caused him to commit suicide. That's kind of the way I see the interpretation falling around. But I know what you're saying.
I kind of see what you're saying. Like another way to think of it is that since he wanted to see the overthrow of the Roman Empire, and this is just maybe his end goal was, I need to get this ball rolling, so that the Roman Empire will kind of crumble. But whenever it doesn't turn out that way, it turns into something else. He feels guilty about it, and does that. But it kind of makes me think too, like, what are those things that we are sacrificing for, that we think Christianity is our sacrifice is going to do what? Like, it's going to bring about what? And if it's not on par with what Jesus is wanting to do, then how will we react to that? Like, whenever we decide, say that by, I don't know, I can't think of an example off the top of my head.
Yeah, and which is what I was struggling with earlier, is it's odd to think of an example.
But it's like, if for instance there was a group of Christians who decided that it was going to be their life to sacrifice themselves to go to a foreign country where they weren't Christian, where they say were Muslim, and it was their goal to convert them to Christianity. Say they went there, that was their goal, that's how they were going to sacrifice to bring about a Christian people. What if that sacrifice didn't bring about a unified Christian people, but became more unified anyway, regardless of everybody was sharing the same belief, but like it was a different outcome to what they sacrificed for, if that makes sense. I don't know, I'm just trying to think of something that
I think people as far as like the idea of fidelity and betrayal, I think you can see that within Christianity in some aspects, because of what was orthodox in some ways ended up being betrayed by some, which changed the orthodoxy. So it wasn't too long ago, the church universal believed that women couldn't preach. And it took people to betray that idea to allow women to preach. There were a time where there was, segregation in churches, and it took an act, or slavery, for instance, and it took an act by someone to betray what was believed universally, and that was an act of fidelity to the faith by opening up to people of other races and other kinds, and to abolish slavery. You see what I'm saying? So there are
betray the established order.
Yeah, there is an instance in that where that takes place.
A higher authority.
Yeah. So I guess he's trying to say that in some instances, but his end game of what he's getting at is a more universal change, that the church is what it is, and it's not going to change unless it's completely dies, basically. Like, there's no reform within itself. There are pockets of change, there's pockets of difference, but to be as I don't know the word I'm looking for, but when Jesus died, the disciples, it wasn't until that point that they realized that the revolution looked a lot different than they intended or thought. It wasn't until his death and resurrection that they got that. So they spent years thinking that Jesus was eventually going to be this ruling king who was going to, drown empire. But what opened up the possibilities for salvation for all people and opened up the bridge between Gentiles and Jewish people, and what opened up the bridge to heaven and earth was this death and resurrection. And so his whole idea, I would assume, is it's not until the church completely dies, or Christianity completely dies, that we're ever going to see that kind of change. Just as much as Jesus changed everything in that death, we won't see that kind of universal movement or change until Christianity is no longer and something else blossoms from it. And for me, I guess the reason why I bring it up and why I think about it is because I think there are instances as Christians where we're told to believe things and we're told to think things, and if we don't fall in line, somehow we are going to go to hell, or we're not good enough, or, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's this whole idea that if somehow we misbelieve something bad's going to happen to us. There's no way to ever truly know exactly what to believe about anything. We are finite human beings. We try in some way to gather information and have a group of faithful followers who help us through things and try to distinguish what is faithful for us. But to say that there's one universal belief in what is all true, that's very difficult to say. You got 6 billion people on the planet that all kind of see eye to eye. But as far as our faith goes and what we think and what we do, sometimes we have to betray the things that we knew, or we have to betray the things that we thought, or betray the way we lived in order to have some sort of fidelity into what Christ would do. That there is some sort of leaving what we normally were, or who we were, or what we did, or how we live, in order to live the way that Christ would want us. That there's always some kind of possibility of that, or some sort of thing that has to die in order for something else to die.
So in that sense, something like, some of those things you name, like, I feel like maybe homosexuality in the church is one of those things that people may need to sacrifice what they've always done for to live or to accept those people in the church as Jesus would have. How will that change? How will that sacrifice change the way that looks? We can't tell, but like, that's, one of those things you don't really know the consequence of it. You just, in your belief in how Jesus would live, you make a sacrifice, and then, only after then, in your faith in that, do you see what happens to it.
And there's all types of thinking.
Right.
It doesn't have to be that. It could be anything,
But that's just an example.
Yeah, realistically.
It's very vague, though. It's hard to picture, and it's hard to imagine, and it's hard to come up with examples just because you're kind of saying rebelling against things that you have been practicing in order to expand what your faith really should be. And that's very, very vague, because what counts as rebelling and what counts as straight up turning your back on it? I'm thinking about a lot of conversations that I would have with non-Christian friends, and how it would be kind of like, well, you pray to a God and I pray to a God, what if it's the same God? And is that rebelling, or is that actually embracing a bigger picture? So and that's just very general. It's kind of hard to really picture.
I think it depends on your heart, your mind, and where you are as far as your faith goes. If you're a person who believes that there is choices that you can make personally that will allow you to remove yourself from the love of Christ, then that's a very difficult choice to make. Right? Like if you intellectually think you can separate yourself from God by what you believe, then yeah, those are hard choices to make. One being me that doesn't believe that way. I don't think there's any way that I can intellectually separate myself from God. I'm a little more free to think some things, or I'm a little more free to explore things that maybe people who intellectually aren't there. And I'm not saying that it's right or wrong. I'm not saying my way is right, and if you think the other way, it's wrong. But there are instances to see that there were people who turned their back on what everyone else said was true and ended up changing the way that the church viewed things, or changed the way that the world functioned in a good way that I would assume Jesus would think. There were millions of people who thought slavery was a good idea. And it took forever for people to come to the decision that that wasn't a good idea. You know? Like, that was an intellectual decision to make, though. But it ultimately came down to their heart decision. Where do we find Jesus in the midst of these things? And I think it goes back to a little bit of stuff we talked about with that new kind of Christianity of Brian McLaren, and being able to let ourselves have a little more freedom and understand that God has a little more grace than we can comprehend sometimes. And I'm not saying these are easy concepts, and I'm not trying to pretend like we're going to solve the world's issues and everybody's going to be hunky-dory in their Christianity moving forward. But I think the ideas are interesting, and I think they always push me to move past my assumptions about what faith is to me and what Christianity really is and what really matters. And it pushes me more and more towards trying to seek out what Jesus actually said and how it really meant in that first world, and what really matters as far as what I do and what I say and how I live.
And I think it just puts you outside the box, like even more. Like I'm thinking of that one story in the Bible where I can't remember where it is, but basically they see this man who's sick, or it might be a woman, and they assume that it's because his parents sinned, or they assume it's because he sinned, or they assume because somebody, something of that nature. Then that was maybe a common thought back then. It was, that person's sick or they're having troubles in their life, they must have done something wrong to upset somebody. And then comes along this idea that, no, we don't really know why that is. We can't for sure say it's because his parents did something or it's because he did something. We aren't necessarily given the answer to that either, but that shift in belief really opens the door. I mean, we can see so many things now, I think in our, if we were confined to that thought right now, I think it'd be different. I think a lot of people can look at they take it situationally. They'll say, in one part of their life, if something bad happens to them, they may think, oh, it's because I've done something, this is coming back around. Or if something bad happens to them, they may be in wonder of it. They may be in question of it. But just the fact that those two can exist in a person's thought process and then their beliefs at the same time based on whatever situation it is a lot bigger of a picture than the closed-minded thinking that this is happening because of this, and opening it to the fact that we don't know, opening to the fact of the ambiguity of how life works and how God works. Really puts you out in the box. And like you said, I think it makes faith a lot bigger than just, well, he's doing bad because he did something bad. There's really no way of knowing. So,
I think that thing, Travis, if we still had that idea that people's circumstances and situations are somehow their fault, that would fundamentally change the way people treat those less fortunate, those in financial trouble or or people suffering diseases and so on. If the belief still existed that they were responsible for it, then there's no need for you to do anything about it. And that's kind of
right. How different would this country be if their belief that people, because of their own actions, were where they were.
But I definitely don't think that belief is not existing.
No. I think it exists, but I think.
But if that was the only,
it's not the only one.
And even if it's not said, even if it's not like a belief, like, oh yeah, I believe that, like you're in this position because you did something wrong, or your family did something wrong, or whatever. Even if it's not said, it's still implied by actions.
Exactly. In many cases, yes. But I think if that was the only belief, then there would be no
caste system in India, for instance.
Right. But I think that
might be an overarching view of that. Like, you are in this position, you will not remove yourself from this position because you or someone else, you were born this way for a reason, and you will not remove yourself from that. Like, you will stay in that until you die or reincarnate.
And I think that just having those, that both beliefs is why even, like, this is just an example of something, but why some of the laws are the way they are, and why we have such trouble trying to make things fair for everybody in this country is that some people believe that they're meant to be in that spot, and some people believe that they aren't. And that's really boiling it down to a really simple concept, of course, but just like thinking about how the existence of both of those things that we may not have thought or weren't open to really puts us in a whole different realm of how do we resolve these differences in our beliefs, because they're obviously way all over the place as opposed to just right here. So
I guess for me, the question that remains in my heart and what continues to haunt me or makes me think about stuff is what part of my Christianity that I hold on to, or what part of my faith do I hold on to, keeps me from experiencing the fullness of what God would have for me. Is there something that remains in my heart, or a thought, or a belief that holds me back from the faith that God would want for me, or the life that God would want for me? And for me, I think that it continually helps me to think about that question, because if it's still a question, then I can seek answers for it. And the only way I know how to do that is through community and through the Bible and through church. That's the only way I know how to do it. And that's kind of why I feel like if I had all the answers, I wouldn't need all of this. So, so I don't for myself, and that's why I still continue to seek it and look after it. And I'm not trying to pull you into what I think or pull you into my way of doing things. It's more of just sharing what I think about and sharing what's on my heart. And I think that's what Jana was doing when she did her lessons. That was what she was thinking about, what was on her heart to share, and this is what's on mine. And that's kind of how we do things. It's not just I'm not trying to make you think what I think. I don't know what else to talk about. It's on my heart and mind. I can't bring something else in here and throw it at you. Like, oh yeah, I was talking about being Baptist. I don't know. Like, that's just not me. So I'm not gonna throw that at you. Well, anyway. Food to chew. All right. So
George made a Mobius strip to show.
Yes, let's see this. Yes.
This is a Mobius strip. Ignore the little edges in there.
It's like a
if you
infinity.
follow the side around,
It never ends.
it only has one side, and if you follow an edge around, it only has one edge.
And this is why we keep these people.
That's
a
awesome.
Mobius strip in 5 seconds with George Young.
Yeah, 5 seconds.
Now, there's a three-dimensional version of that. That's a container with no outside and no inside, but it's a little harder to make it out of a piece of paper.
Jeez, George.
That's
Come
Should
on,
have
guys.
done it.
Long time.
yeah.
So what do we want to do now, moving forward?
Not the meat cake. Oh, what? No, you're telling me.
Anybody had any thoughts about this? Things that they might like to talk about, study?
I mean, I like the questions were provoking. I don't think I had anything else to say. I think I'm especially interested in this because I am dating someone who has had a bad experience with church-going people growing up. And so when I let him know that I was coming to a Bible study, it actually upset him. And I had to talk him down and let him know it's not what you think it is, because I think he grew up around some really extremist point of views and friends who have kind of unfriended him and denied him because they don't believe the things he believes. And so he thinks they're all crazy, and I kind of agree. So I think it was upsetting to him to think that I was joining that. And so, so for me, it's kind of an interesting experience for me to re-involve myself, but also know there's a person in my life who I'd like to almost translate it for. So,
show him that, and he's going to realize we're not that tight.
Right. No, that's actually what I was thinking this entire time. I was like, man. I would like to be better equipped with the tools of how to explain that, because I agree, but it is very complicated concepts to understand for sure.
Speaking of complicated concepts.
Yeah.
What's the name of this book?
Fidelity of Betrayal.
Is it all about Judas?
No. It's just how he frames the
Opening question.
his book.
I'd be interested in reading more about this.
You can read all about it.
Or even having it as a topic of Bible study, possibly.
I need a dictionary to go with all the big words.
Yeah.
You would.
Book club, Bible book
I think he's like a double PhD in like philosophy and blah 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 or something.
Yeah.
I mean, all of them.
The number of times all of us had said before, no, I don't know what that works.
Well, I mean, obviously, I'm not against that. But is there anything else? Amy, do you have any thoughts of stuff that we could look at or study?
Sorry. I'm trying to think. I really like this discussion because it sort of tears apart the whole concept of what the betrayal was, or if it even really was a betrayal, because, without Judas, we wouldn't really have the basis of Christianity going on. So, I don't know. I like more in-depth text like that, but I don't have any suggestions.
Yeah, that's fine. Not quite sure how to hold this.
I know, it's already almost came apart.
Yeah, it's almost falling apart.
So if you did a book group, is that hard to is there preparation in that? Is that like, hey, read this whole book ahead of time, tell us,
Well, the last time we did a book, I just read it and then I explained it and did questions on it. We didn't just read it.
Yeah,
we just didn't read it. And then we interviewed the author, which is cool.
That was awesome.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Brian McLaren.
McLaren did a Google Hangout with us. It
Yeah.
was awesome. I was up for my first night.
Were you there for that?
It was my first
Wow.
time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man, we set the bar too high.
Yeah, we just bring authors and shit up. Well, if you guys think of anything else, let me know, and we can. I'll think of some other ideas too.
A chapter at a time wouldn't be, I don't think it would be like craziness.
It'd be like that.
Mm-hmm.
Trav, you got any thoughts?
About what we should do? I'm thinking, dude.
I don't see other than
I know. I'm kind of like.
spider hands.
Spider.
Oh no, I've been looking at. Since I've been teaching kind of Sunday school for the past couple of months and looking at the Apocrypha, just like random ideas that you don't really know where they come from. It's interesting finding out where they come from.
Oh yeah.
Not that, again, like very vague, but with the sense of the Apocrypha, like seeing how those books, even though they're not in our canon, can parallel things that we believe, stories, themes that we believe that for some reason were included. So like that whole idea of kind of finding truth wherever it is. And then, I mean, I like this book as well. I wouldn't mind doing the book, but just, and maybe even, and I can't think of examples because I can't, but like just stories that we, from you know, our education and from our young age are brought to believe are matter of fact may not be so matter of fact. Like this story, Judas, you know, there's probably another one. I think of, this is kind of just an example, but like seeing the movie Noah makes you think of a different, whether or not it's true, thinking about how Noah was during all that in his faithfulness to God, and whether, because honestly, now that we talk about both, he thinks, or at least in the movie, not that he thought this, Noah thought this, but the movie presents a thought that Noah believed that he was chosen by God to basically save the animals because they were the only pure thing on the earth. And so that was his faith. That's what he believed that God wanted him to do, and he followed it. And then realized maybe that's not what I was called to do in my faithfulness. And so that kind of idea of being faithful to something that you really believe in his case to God, but then really not knowing what exactly you're doing in that is kind of a similar theme, I think. But just thinking about the characters themselves and just automatically assuming that the way they believe something was so clear cut and then not, I think would be interesting to look at. I can't think of, there's other characters, you know, like looking into more of, like it could be anything from like maybe a different interpretation of what Abraham was feeling when he took Isaac, you know, anything, you know, that we just assume, oh, I'll just take him up there and I'm ready, you know, here we go. Like there, no struggle, it seems like, was had there, at least in the account that we have, but you know, like, is there any other idea about how that happened? Anything to just kind of expand our thoughts about characters that we just assume.
Has anybody read Fear and Trembling by Soren Kierkegaard?
I have.
Okay. So anytime I think of Abraham, I think of that.
Soren Kierkegaard.
We could try to read that.
I mean, Soren Kierkegaard's amazing. Heady stuff is
very heady.
Yeah, it's heady stuff as well. Fear and Trembling is not so bad because it's not like one of his thick books. This is that one. But I mean, obviously, if you were going to talk about that story, you would mention that in general. So maybe not read it, but if you use that story as
We're just maybe trying to find some characters like that, some stories like that. But then I always think too, like I think another interesting thing to talk about is that was Christianity supposed to be simple concept for us, or was it not?
Yeah.
Like, do we need genius philosophers to explain what our beliefs should be, or should it be like what was the like? And I don't know the answer to this, but like, what's just thinking out loud? Like, what is the how was Christianity supposed to be intended for us? Was it supposed to be something that we easily grasped and that we're like, oh, okay, you know, this is how I should live, or it should be something that we're just constantly being like brought out of our box into what we've always thought? Is that what Christianity is about? Is it about really getting outside of that simplicity and trying to find yourself in all that, or is it about being simple? You know, like I think that that's an interesting question too, because I think that there's a lot of people that believe both ways.
Yeah, I think the quick answer for me would be yes and yes.
Yeah, I mean,
Jesus spent 3 years blowing those people's minds, but the stuff that he taught, if you pared it down, was simply living.
Right.
Like live with your community, share with your community, take care of your community. Like it wasn't like this globalization world that we live in now, which is totally different than any kind of world Jesus saw. But
it's just, I guess, how the simplicity of the faith, how that happens in such a complicated world, I feel like. Because I think loving your neighbor makes perfect sense. But then, like you said, if Jesus whenever it's introduced that slavery is not acceptable, like, that blows people's minds. That turns, everything on its head.
The Bible says have slaves and masters.
So, like, taking that simple concept of faith, but then figuring out.
I don't know why they talk like that either.
Well, I mean,
they're
totally weird.
I just made them talk like that.
I just think there's a lot in there, a lot in some of these characters.
Pioneers.
Yeah.
Pioneers.
That's,
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of interesting thought behind a lot of characters in the Bible that we don't necessarily give to them. Besides, they're just faithful servants to the end. I don't know. That probably wasn't an answer specifically to your question, but kind of thinking of things.
Yeah, any kind of thoughts about stuff. It's good.
I appreciate that if we were to go into a conversation that is this heady, as you said, it would be right paired after studying disciplines, because for me, I kind of need a balance of structure and abstract, and these concepts are very abstract and they're very, very open-ended, and I need some scaffolding to be able to put myself in a place to think about abstract thoughts. And I think that's a thought that a lot of people either go drastically one side, drastically the other side, whereas taking communion while also thinking about the broader picture and meditating regularly while also thinking about breaking barriers. It's interesting to me.
Thanks for bringing it up. It's really smart. I think that I'm not particularly good with that. Structuring myself around the ideas and keeping it within the framework of being spiritually disciplined through some sort of prayer practice or some sort of ritual that I hold on to as this is where my ground is. Stay up here and head knowledge land. Because as much as I like this stuff, to act like I'm going to sit here and comprehend everything at all times, it's just something. I mean, hell, like one sentence in, I couldn't pronounce a word in there, so. Right. Well, cool. Well, we'll do something. It will be fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Always is.
That's all it is.
Also, I have an announcement.
Yeah, announcements and prayer.
Sorry. Well, and then yeah. So, and this may not apply to all of you in here. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can probably disregard it. But for a number of months, I have been announcing every week that we are joining the seniors for a senior party cookout thing Friday, August 1st.
So welcome them to young adulthood.
Yes, to welcome them to young adulthood. Yes. So I've been telling y'all to put it on your calendar. I've been telling y'all to be there. And then I get a text this week that says there's going to be a few seniors that can't be there on Friday that they just found out about. And so they would like to move the cookout to Monday, August 4th. I know y'all will be gone. I will be gone. You'll be gone?
Me?
We're going Tuesday.
We're on Tuesday.
Okay.
This time.
Yeah, like as in a week from or
Yesterday.
less than a week from yes. Yes.
Yes.
And so I guess this may not be the best group of people to poll, but who would be available to go to the senior thing on Monday, August 4th?
I could be available.
Yeah.
I'll be available.
Kelly's not coming, by the way. Just as another side note.
No, that's not the thing. You can't do it. Can't do it right now.
It's like
Preparation.
Like a dinner.
it's probably dinner. I don't.
They have school, so that's school.
No.
Seniors.
Seniors.
Seniors, they're going to college.
We were welcoming them into this group. That's
Right.
the idea.
It's okay. I'm not in
Is
school.
Is it
yet.
already like you just need to show up? Or
It's literally, to my knowledge, the there's already a house, and I'm assuming all this. There's a house. There's somebody taking care of this.
Yes.
The only thing that we would do is show up, get to know them some. If you don't, just kind of hang out with them as a way of saying, get to know us a little bit, so you know who we are when you come back from college, or if you decide to join us on that, every Tuesday, or if you care.
Several of them aren't moving.
Should we break
They'll
them?
be here.
Okay, and some of them.
They'll be in Memphis.
Some of them are going to Memphis. And so it's just to give us an opportunity to kind of bridge the gap a little bit with them. Even though most of us are older and are out of college, this is kind of the best thing we got to a transition period. As far as when they graduate from youth group, there's really no place for them except for, there used not to be a group like this, and there is. And maybe at some point there'll be an actual thriving college age group, but there's really not, and so we're kind of the next step. And so even though I don't, it's a little different because they're a little younger, but at the same time, they're out of high school, and this is, like I said, this is the phase, this is the place that they have basically, and so we want to try to make them feel as welcome as they can.
No more goofing off. Time for them to grow up.
That's right. I don't goof off ever.
And if you do, we now
And if
have
you
a
do,
wrestler that's going to take you to the ground.
Yeah, that's right.
Gold medal.
Sorry.
So that was a really long-winded answer to your question. But yes, we are just supposed to show up and hang out, and that's really all it is. And my thought was, if a lot of, well, not necessarily the less people there are, the worse, but if there's not going to be more than like 2 of us there, I don't want to say it's not
It looks
worth,
unwelcoming.
but like if it should, granted, there's only like 7, 8 seniors, so if we took our whole group and had like 15 people and we're like, hey, around them, that might be a little intimidating, but I'm not really sure.
There's a bunch of people that
Because they're
aren't
so
here
short.
that we could reach out to that might come.
That's true.
Lots of people who are younger who don't necessarily come to this group are around town. Like
Mhm.
they're hanging out and doing other stuff, but they're here
Right.
that we could talk to. So it's not like this is it, we got nothing else. Like there's a whole group of young adults that, there's people that show up to trivia that are not here. There are people who show up on Sunday mornings that don't show up here necessarily. So
Well, I guess let me rephrase. The sphere of influence that I speak to, I guess, would include those that I see.
Right.
So from those, I don't know about all these other people that are around who you're I think I know who you're talking about, but I don't really talk to them as much. But I guess for those of you here, and for those that are part of our group, I guess like regularly, if you're able to be there on Monday, I don't know a time. I might.
I'll text you. I have your numbers.
Oh, thank you.
And I can,
Nathaniel,
I'm
Are you even going
He's
to
gonna
He's
be-
going to be on vacation.
he's gonna be a big baller.
You going on
So
vacation?
I am.
Oh, I didn't know
Aren't
you
you on
had
vacation?
I am.
Well,
Oh, I thought you were both going.
We're
we're
both
both
going.
going.
She's going for
I'm
work.
going.
Oh, okay. But you're both gonna be gone.
That's what I'm talking about.
That's amazing. Well said. Well said.
Where are you
So
going?
California.
What part?
Carlsbad.
What is that?
It is
It's not close
like an hour
Home Shun Run.
south of San Diego.
Home,
Yeah.
what is it? Home Star
enough. You
Runner.
can't get an hour south. San Diego and then Mexican border.
I don't know where it is.
But
My
it-
geography's
It's
terrible.
Southern California.
It's
Yeah,
in-
we're in
It's
San
close to
Francisco.
San Diego.
It's
We're
in
in San
between.
Francisco.
It's in between San Diego and Los Angeles.
So wherever that is.
It's about an hour
It's like-
south of Los Angeles, about 45 minutes north of San Diego.
Ah, yes. There you go.
Speaking of Sunday mornings, how's that going for Sunday school, and when is there an end
We
date?
are done.
Okay.
We have
It has gone very well.
And gone about well.
Swimming.
Well, actually, there really was never a date. They just kind of were like, join us for the summer, and I was like, I'm pretty sure I can milk the Apocrypha through July, and then, then I pretty much don't have anything else to talk about.
Couldn't milk it no more.
I mean, there's a lot more.
Apocrypha.
There's a lot more, but it's hard to like.
My new book. Milk the
Yeah.
Actually, it's my new band.
So, I mean, if we want to, I'm sure we can still meet with them for a few weeks in August. I'm sure they would not care. I have no idea.
I am thinking that more than likely my young adult Sunday morning thing is over, and for the foreseeable future, until there's a possibility of having an associate, which hopefully is going to happen very soon.
Mm-hmm.
So what's that looking like?
We've got information out, so we're just looking at this point. So if we can find somebody to fill it, we'll get it.
Have there been any applicants?
I'm talking to one person tomorrow, but they haven't really applied, but I'm going to talk to them about it. So, yeah, keep that in your prayers.
Applying is hard.
But as far as that goes, I'll be involved with probably the youth trying to get that to have some sort of shape, as it hasn't really recently. But Tuesdays should be free again, so I should be around more, which is good, because I won't be basically out of town for 4 or 5 weeks at a time.
No, we're really glad to have you back.
Yeah.
For the record.
Yeah.
Not just because you're a good teacher and all, but just because it's good to have you
I like
back.
to be around
Glad
people.
you're back.
Yeah.
So in other words, unless one of us wants to, or unless we can figure out something to do for Sunday school.
Like milkshakes with the Apocrypha.
So,
Freeze it, shake it.
We could take our picture for the catalog.
Yeah.
Sunday school.
Yeah.
Sunday morning.
Do I take a group photo?
We don't even need an individual spot. We'll just have a young adult.
Yeah.
Like it will be a picture and it'll say young adult. And then the address will say
Matthew's house, bro.
the address will say asterisk multiple locations.
Are any of the CDs going to votes?
No. There's a couple. Is there a couple going to U of M?
Two are going to Memphis.
I was just wondering if I was going to see them.
Yeah, you will.
Elaine.
Oh, unless they're around. I don't know if they'll be. Who's going?
Madison.
Madison, excuse me.
Madison and Jordan. 2 at UT, 1 at SMU, and then
Clemson.
Clemson.
Who's going to Clemson?
Hunter.
Richardson.
I just, yeah.
Went there.
That's only 5. What are the other 3 then?
2 in Memphis, 2 in UT, SMU, Clemson.
Ole Miss.
6.
We had
Oh, Madison Hamlet's going to Ole Miss. No, she's going to Memphis.
Pate is going to
Pate's going to Ole Miss.
Yes, I had to say that.
You just said Ole Miss.
Yeah, I did.
There's one. Oh no. That's true.
Just 7. Prayers? Anything?
Continuing prayers for my mom. She's been doing really well, but I talked to my brother just very briefly yesterday and said that her blood pressure has been really low, which is very abnormal, because she's always had high blood pressure, which is why she had the mini stroke and probably has the aortic aneurysm. So he's supposed to be getting her hooked up with the doctor at Vandy this week just to figure out stuff. So.
My aunt has just started chemotherapy for the tumor in her stomach, and it's going well so far, but it's 3 days in and it's got more to go.
Don't find that say,
George officially signed the contract, so he's employed.
Yeah. And then he's going on
Right.
vacation. I love it, man.
Well, he
Good
doesn't
job.
start till the end of August. It was kind of awkward. They're like, when can you start? And he's like, well, I'm going on vacation.
Not awkward at all. It's awesome.
Well, I'm working. You can count it. I don't get paid, so never mind. Not the kind of work you want to do.
Anything else going on? Somebody want to pray for us before we go? Just like talking to the youth group.
I can.
Just real quiet. Bring up prayer. Everybody's like,
least it's not that nose thing. It's never
Yeah,
been
the
that.
nose thing.
I was like, hit myself in the face.
All right. Dear God, thank you for tonight. Thank you for this group of people and for all the different thoughts and beliefs and opinions and just faith that we have in you, God. And please help us get to a spot where we are comfortable, or not necessarily comfortable, but just strong in our faith, whatever it is, and open to the infinite nature of you. And just please also let us know that you're not just infinite, but also personal, and that you are with us every day. And, we just pray for all these prayer requests that have been lifted up today, for all the sickness and all the illness, and for all the tests, and for all the doctors and all the hospitals and all the medical facilities that are treating our loved ones. And we just pray that they be comforted, and that that you just give them your peace. And we just lift up all these prayer requests and just continuously pray for your guidance in our lives every day. We just pray all these things in your name. Amen. And
happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear George. Happy birthday to you. Yay! Y'all stick around. We got some cake to celebrate.
Maybe we'll send you the cake through the internet.
That's okay. I'm gonna hoard my quiche. It's all right.
Okay.
She's got her birthday quiche going on.
We'll mail you a piece of cake.
Yeah.
Okay, you'll get a slice of quiche.
Bye, Amy.
Bye, Amy.
Bye.
Good night. All right, so Jana made these homemade cakes.